It started as one of those rare mornings where the air felt unusually tender, almost nostalgic. We hadn't had many of those lately. There was something bittersweet about the way she lingered in bed, her fingers absent-mindedly running over the folds of the sheet. I noticed how her gaze darted around the room, carefully avoiding mine. It was as though she had rehearsed something in her head 1,000 times but couldn't find the courage to say it out loud. And then, with a deep breath, she did. "Can we talk?" Her voice was steady, yet I could sense an undercurrent of nervousness. "Of course," I replied, sitting up, trying to brace myself for whatever was coming. I love you," she began, her voice soft. "But I also love someone else." The words hit me like a freight train. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. Surely, she wasn't saying what I thought she was. But the way her eyes flicked to mine, just briefly, before settling back on the sheet, told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't joking. "I've been thinking," she continued, her tone trembling now, "about how to make this work, and he and I, think it's only fair if I spend 1 week with you and the next with him." Time seemed to freeze. The sunlight streaming through the window felt too warm, almost oppressive. I couldn't comprehend the audacity of her words. My mind raced to make sense of it, but no sense could be found. The silence between us stretched unbearably. Finally, I stood, wordlessly, mechanically. My body moved on autopilot as I got dressed. The part of me that might have shouted or cried was locked away, buried under the shock. She followed me as I walked to the door. "Please say something," she pleaded. "You love me, don't you? Just think about it." I stopped, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I turned to face her, and for a moment our eyes met. Hers were filled with tears, mine with disbelief. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Not yet. Instead, I left the room, her desperate voice trailing after me. I spent the day wandering aimlessly, replaying her words in my head. 1 week with you, 1 week with him. It sounded like something out of a bad sitcom. Not my life. The woman I had shared my hopes, dreams, and future with had just proposed dividing herself like a piece of property. And the worst part? She seemed to believe it was reasonable. By the evening, I had made my decision. Returning home, I found her waiting, her face streaked with tears. She rushed to me as I stepped inside. "I'll stay with you," she cried. "Just you. Forget what I said earlier. I made a mistake. I'll fix it." Her words sounded genuine, but they felt like a bandage over a gaping wound. I stood there, numb, before finally replying. "No," I said quietly. "I won't share you. I won't be part of this." Her sobs grew louder as she begged me to reconsider. And for a moment I almost did. Her pain looked so real. But the thought of her with someone else, even for a moment, was unbearable. I couldn't live like that. Against my better judgment, I gave her another chance. Perhaps it was the memories of the love we had shared, or the faint hope that she truly meant her words. Whatever it was, I chose to believe her, for now. But the days that followed were anything but comforting. She tried, or at least pretended to. She stayed by my side, reassured me that the other man was out of the picture, and did her best to show affection. Yet something felt off. It was in the way she avoided my touch one moment, only to cling to me desperately the next. It was in her laughter, which sounded hollow, and her words, which felt rehearsed. There were moments I wanted to confront her, to ask if she was being honest. But I was afraid of the answer. I wanted to believe that this was just a rough patch, something we could overcome. But deep down I knew it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. When you choose to believe in someone after a betrayal, it feels like balancing on a tightrope over a canyon. Every step wobbles. Every gust of doubt threatens to send you crashing down. That's how I felt in the days following her tearful apology. She assured me it was over, promised me she'd cut all ties with the other man. Her words were desperate, pleading, soaked in tears. For reasons I can only describe as foolish optimism, or perhaps just the ghost of the love we once had, I chose to believe her. I wanted to believe her. The first week was awkward but tolerable. She was trying, I'll give her that. breakfasts together, her soft hand brushing against mine at the table, even the occasional spontaneous hug. It all painted a picture of reconciliation. But the paint was thin, the cracks of doubt showing through no matter how much she tried to cover them. One evening, I caught her staring out the window, her eyes distant and unfocused. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, careful to keep my tone casual. She startled, as if I'd caught her red-handed. "Oh, nothing," she replied quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just work stuff." It wasn't work stuff. I knew it wasn't work stuff. By the second week, things began to shift. Her moods became erratic. Some days, she was overly affectionate, clinging to me as if trying to convince herself she wanted this. Other days, she was cold, her responses curt and her gaze perpetually fixed on her phone. When I asked her if everything was okay, she would plaster on a smile and say, "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" But I knew better. One night, I suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in months. She agreed but spent the entire time scrolling through her phone, only looking up at the screen during the loud action scenes. "Is it that boring?" I joked, trying to keep the mood light. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "No, it's fine. Just checking messages." "From work?" I pressed. Her hesitation was slight, but it was there. "Yeah, work." The tightrope wobbled beneath me again. The turning point came when she suggested we attend a friend's upcoming party. "It'll be fun," she said, her voice unusually bright. "A chance to reconnect with people. You know?" The idea of being surrounded by mutual friends, pretending everything was fine, made my stomach churn. But she seemed genuinely excited about it. More excited than I'd seen her about anything involving me in weeks, so I agreed. The day of the party arrived, and I'll admit, I was hopeful. Maybe this was her way of showing she was committed to us, that she wanted to rebuild what we had. She spent hours getting ready, humming softly as she did her makeup. It reminded me of the early days of our relationship, back when her excitement about a night out was contagious. "You look amazing," I said sincerely as she stepped out of the bedroom in a sleek navy dress. She smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt? Perhaps? Doubt? Couldn't tell. At the party, she was a social butterfly, flitting from one conversation to another with ease. I tried to keep up, but the truth is, I've never been good in social settings. Small talk exhausts me. So, after about an hour, I found myself retreating to a quieter corner of the room, nursing a drink and watching her from afar. She seemed happy, carefree, but there was something about the way she moved through the crowd that made me uneasy. I noticed she was spending a lot of time at a particular table, laughing a little too loudly, her hand brushing against someone's arm a little too casually. It was him. I don't know how I knew, but I did. Call it intuition or paranoia, but I knew the man she was talking to was the one she had professed to love just a few weeks earlier. My chest tightened as I watched her throw her head back in laughter, her body language open and inviting. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe he was just an old friend. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But as the night wore on, my doubts solidified into certainty. At one point, she excused herself from the table and disappeared down a hallway. He followed a few moments later. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to stay put, to trust that she was telling the truth when she said it was over. But another part of me, the part that had been watching her distance herself for weeks, knew I couldn't ignore this. I set my drink down and followed. The hallway was dimly lit, and the sound of the party faded behind me. I walked slowly, my footsteps almost silent against the carpeted floor. As I turned a corner, I saw them. They weren't doing anything overtly incriminating, just standing close, talking in hushed tones. But it was the way they looked at each other, the way her hand rested lightly on his arm, that made my stomach churn. I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I turned and walked away, my mind racing. I needed time to process what I had seen to decide what to do next. When she returned to the main room a few minutes later, she acted as if nothing had happened. She came to me, smiling, and asked if I was having a good time. "It's fine," I replied, forcing a smile of my own. But inside I was anything but fine. I knew this wasn't over. Far from it. The party hummed along like a well-oiled machine of laughter, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly normal. She was the life of the gathering, moving effortlessly between groups, her laugh ringing out like a melody I hadn't heard in months. I stood by the snack table, sipping on a drink I barely tasted, trying to blend into the background. My eyes tracked her movements across the room. At first, I convinced myself that her laughter was genuine, that this was her way of mending things between us. Maybe she needed to prove to herself or to me that she could still enjoy life while staying committed. But the longer I watched, the more I noticed the subtleties. The way her smile grew wider when she glanced toward a specific table, how her body unconsciously leaned toward a certain direction. It didn't take long to spot him, the man she once claimed to also love. He was seated a few tables away, surrounded by a small group. They weren't speaking, but their body language told a story louder than words. A glance here, a lingering look there. It was a conversation happening in silence, one I wasn't meant to be part of. She caught me looking and quickly turned away, her hand brushing her hair as if to dismiss the tension. I swallowed the knot forming in my throat, trying to calm the storm brewing inside me. As the evening wore on, I noticed her heading toward a quieter corner of the room where a long, elegantly draped table stood. She glanced over her shoulder once before slipping behind it. Something about the furtiveness of her movements didn't sit right. My gut screamed at me to follow her, but I hesitated, clinging to a threadbare hope that I was overreacting. I watched as he excused himself from his group and casually walked toward the same corner. He disappeared behind the table, and my pulse quickened. This wasn't paranoia anymore. The air felt thick and heavy as I approached the table. The chatter of the party seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythmic pounding of my heart in my ears. I stepped closer, careful to move quietly, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe they were just talking. Maybe they needed privacy to finally close this chapter. But as I drew closer, I caught a movement beneath the heavy fabric of the tablecloth. My breath caught. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before crouching down and lifting the edge of the drape. There they were. She knelt on the carpeted floor, her face inches away from his, her hands fumbling with the waistband of his pants. The sight was so surreal, so grotesque in its intimacy, that for a moment I doubted my own eyes. But then, as if sensing my presence, her head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto mine. Time stopped. The room, the music, the laughter. All of it melted into a void of silence. She froze, her hand still gripping the fabric of his trousers. He turned his head, his expression a mix of shock and panic, his face draining of color. I straightened, my chest heaving as I tried to control the wave of anger and humiliation washing over me. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and for a fleeting moment, I considered storming away, swallowing this betrayal like a bitter pill. But no, not this time. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with air, and spoke. My voice was steady, loud enough to cut through the din of the party. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my words slicing through the air like a blade. The room fell silent, heads turning toward me as if pulled by an invisible string. I apologize for the interruption, but I feel it's necessary to address something. I paused, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Her eyes widened, tears already pooling, as she scrambled out from under the table, her movements clumsy and frantic. "She's been cheating on me," I announced, my voice clear and unwavering. "Right here under this table in front of all of you." Gasps rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Whispers erupted as people tried to process what they were hearing. Someone dropped their glass, the sharp crack of shattering crystal punctuating the silence. She stood there, her face streaked with tears, stammering incoherent apologies. I didn't mean, it's not what it looks like," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lies. I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me. Not what it looks like. Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is. He tried to slink away, his head ducked low, but I wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. And you? I said, turning to him, my voice dripping with disdain. How does it feel to be the other man? Sneaking around like a coward? Do you think this makes you better than me? He didn't respond, his face burning red as the room's attention shifted to him. Her sobs grew louder, and she reached for me, her hands trembling. Please, she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. Please let me explain. I made a mistake, but I love you. I swear I do. I took a step back, avoiding her touch. No, I said firmly. This isn't love. Whatever this is, it's not love. The room seemed to close in around us, the stares of our friends and acquaintances burning into my back. But I didn't care. I had said what I needed to say. This is the end, I said, my voice resolute. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of her own decisions. The party continued behind me, but I didn't look back. For the first time in weeks I felt free. Broken but free. The drive home that night felt endless. The air outside was cool and still, but inside the car it was suffocating. My thoughts swirled like a tornado, each memory and emotion spinning out of control. I had just dismantled my life in front of a room full of people, leaving behind not just her but every hope and plan I'd once clung to. The house was eerily quiet when I stepped inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation had drained, leaving behind exhaustion and an ache so deep it felt like my chest was caving in. Her face, tear-streaked, pleading, kept flashing in my mind. For years I had loved that face. I had memorized every curve, every freckle, every expression. And now it was a mask I could no longer trust. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt intrusive, almost mocking. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my untouched coffee. My phone buzzed. It was her. Please, can we talk? The message read. I didn't reply. Over the next few days, the texts and calls came in waves. First apologetic, then defensive, then desperate. She even showed up at the house once, knocking for nearly 20 minutes. I stayed inside, watching her through the peephole until she finally gave up and left. I wasn't ready to hear her voice. Not yet. Instead, I focused on myself. I started therapy, something I'd always told myself I didn't need. But sitting in that small office, recounting everything to a stranger, I felt a weight begin to lift. For the first time, I said out loud the words I'd been avoiding. I deserve better. Therapy wasn't a magic solution, but it helped. Slowly, I began to piece myself back together. I threw myself into work, picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned, and reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself that I'd lost along the way. About a month after the party, I decided it was time to speak with her. Not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed closure. We met at a small cafe, neutral ground. She looked different, her hair pulled back, her makeup minimal. She looked tired. I'm glad you came, she said softly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. I came because I need to say some things, I replied, my voice steady. And I'll listen to you, but this isn't about getting back together. Her face fell, but she nodded. I understand. I took a deep breath. You broke something that can't be fixed. For weeks, maybe longer, you lied to me, made me feel like I was the problem. You asked me to trust you when you didn't deserve it. And the worst part is I gave you that trust. I gave you everything I had, and it still wasn't enough for you. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't stop. I deserve more than this. I deserve honesty, respect, and love that doesn't come with conditions or secrets. I don't hate you, but I can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. I know I hurt you. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm sorry. For everything. I nodded, standing to leave. Take care of yourself, I said, my tone soft but firm. And with that, I walked away, closing the door on that chapter of my life for good. In the weeks and months that followed, life moved on. It wasn't always easy. Some days, the loneliness crept in like a shadow, whispering doubts in my ear. But those moments grew fewer with time. I started to realize that the breakup wasn't just an ending. It was also a beginning, a chance to rediscover who I was outside of that relationship. One evening, as I was sorting through old boxes in the attic, I came across a forgotten notebook from years ago. Flipping through its pages, I found sketches of projects I dreamed of starting but never had the time for. One in particular, a woodworking project, caught my eye. The next day, I visited a hardware store and bought the supplies I needed. Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into the project, finding solace in the rhythm of sanding, cutting, and assembling. By the time it was finished, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. My family and friends became my biggest support system. They reminded me that it was okay to grieve, to feel angry, and to take my time healing. And slowly I started to believe them. About 6 months after the breakup, I found myself at another party. A smaller, quieter one, hosted by a coworker. I hadn't planned to go, but something about the invitation felt different. It was there that I met her. She wasn't flashy or loud, but there was a warmth to her that immediately drew me in. We spent the evening talking about everything and nothing. When I told her about my woodworking project, her eyes lit up, and she asked to see pictures. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me. I wasn't just the man who'd been betrayed. I was someone new, someone stronger. Looking back now, I don't regret what happened. It taught me to value myself, to set boundaries, and to recognize the kind of love I truly deserve. And most importantly, it taught me that even after the darkest of nights, the sun will always rise again. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.